All right. Welcome everyone to our live event at Industrial Logic. Today we are talking deadlines, discovery, and delivery. Can we have it all? Thank you for all of you joining us. And as you slowly start to trickle in, I'm going to do some intros. So I am Tara Scott. I've been working in the tech space for about 11, almost 12 years now. And I work a lot in the product world with UX, user experience, user research, as well as a bunch of stuff around organizational behavior, how to bring your best self to work and actually measure the progress of your ecosystems when you have healthier behavior. That's a little bit about me. Spent a decade prior to that in healthcare, in mental health, and that kind of is how I found this world of tech and behavior meshed together. But Jay, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thanks, Tara. My name is Jay Mansaray. I am a product coaching consultant. Been working in tech now for, Louise, almost a decade. Working on building digital products, connected products, consumer-centric products, and executive coaching. So, yeah, excited to have this conversation with Tara today. I know we have a lot of conversations one-on-one, but it's nice to be able to bring other people into the fold and kind of get everyone's perspective on different product topics. So yeah, thanks.
For sure. All right, well, let's kick this thing off. So Jay, like you mentioned, you and I have had so many conversations around what it means to want to be able to deliver the right thing, and also having these deadlines that seem to be, I want to call it an unintentional evil, but I don't know how, or a necessary evil, but I'm not sure how necessary or intentional it is when we're kind of in reactive mode. So maybe we should start with kind of what we've seen and what led us to this topic in the first place, of why we want to talk about, what do we see and what have we seen historically when it comes to being able to do the creative stuff and create something for people that they actually enjoy, versus I have to get it done, and never looking in the rearview mirror to pay attention to what you've learned or make sure you're moving in the right direction.
Absolutely. I think at the core of it, right, it really starts and ends with values. And from an organizational perspective, it starts with the values of leadership, whoever you consider that to be, whether that be your C-suite or your manager or maybe your director, whoever you're reporting to. And ultimately, what I've experienced and what I've seen is that there's usually a trickle-down effect, right? Like there's obviously a bottom line. It's a business. We're not all just participating for fun. And we want to see profits, right? We want to see increased engagement. We want to see numbers move. And so I think, and that's not a bad thing at all. However, I do think though that when profits or when revenue are the primary focus, are seen as the primary focus or the primary goal, rather than a constraint on what the teams can do, you start to see people making decisions against that, right? So what makes us the dollar the fastest? What looks like it's going to be the most profitable? What do we have to do in order to get people in the door, to get people purchasing, versus what do we do that makes our customers happy? What can we do that makes our users delighted? What can we do that makes our users' lives easier? And how can we then translate that happiness and that value into revenue for our teams or our product or organization?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that it's all about finding those values within the organization and actually talking about them. My first foray, and I've talked about this before on lives, but my first foray into user research was working for a startup who didn't do any. So they met with their customers once a year to find out what they wanted. Well, when you're working at a startup, or actually when you're working in any organization, you have to have a pulse on what people want and what they need. And so we started a program where we were speaking with users every week to try and figure out, what is it people wanted, what is it they didn't want, and how can we actually measure the value of what we're creating using quantitative and qualitative data. So some of it's going to be conversational and it might look a little subjective, and that's a good thing. Like, we want to allow people to tell their stories and have a voice, and then also measure, okay, well, if we change something in terms of a feature of a product, what does it look like once we put it out there? So being able to utilize tools to allow you to see, is someone frustrated and clicking on something like 10 times and not getting to what they need? Or is it a really smooth experience for them most of the time? But maybe there's too many steps involved. So if you don't take some time to do a bit of that research, you're missing so much value for the product. But the key is, to your point, businesses have to make money. So it's not, I feel like people often come in thinking it has to be one or the other. I often hear, and I know you've heard this because we've talked about it, like, I don't have time. We don't have time to do any product discovery. We have to go. We have to deliver the right thing. Well, you don't know if you're delivering the right thing if you don't do that product discovery work in step with the delivery. So I think a lot of times folks think it has to be one or the other. I either have to deliver stuff or I have to do research. And it has to be a conversation around the values of the organization, just like you said, about how do we put these things together so we can actually deliver something valuable.
Absolutely. And I think it's interesting. I was listening to I think maybe it was a video on Instagram, and this business consultant this entrepreneur who talked about his business, and he was saying people, they say essentially something along the lines of like, if you stay ready, you never have to get ready, right? Because he was like, ultimately, because he was like, the opportunity is going to meet you no matter what you do. Like, you're going to get the opportunity. And he was like, either you're going to be ready for it or it's going to reveal that you're not prepared. And I think that's how I think a lot of times businesses lose sight of their own deadlines, and the time's going to come, right? August is going to come, September is going to come, Q3 is going to come. Like, the time is going to come either way. And you're either going to be prepared for that time or it's going to reveal that you're not prepared. And I think in that case, when we're talking about like, we have to deliver, you can put as much as you want on the plate. You can put as much as you want in the backlog. You can run the teams ragged, running, working 80-hour weeks to get it done. But ultimately, if it's not feasible, it's not feasible, right? And so I think that's a conversation that's really hard for some teams and some management to have, is that the reality is the reality and the capacity is the capacity. You can either choose to pour all these things onto your plate, right, and not execute on them or not execute on them well, or you can be realistic about, if I had to, what are the most important things that need to be done by this time, and what can I do to get the closest to that, versus completing all of this work and then putting yourself in a position where you may have to go back and redo all of it, or find out, to your point, because you're not talking to your users, that you now have to completely change direction because the thing that you were building wasn't the correct thing in the whole time.
Right. I think that there are often assumptions, especially in companies where they're building things internally, that it's that cognitive bias. It's which we teach in some of our boot camps. It's the cognitive bias of the IKEA effect. It's, if you build it yourself, then it's great, and there's nothing wrong with it. And that is, we are doing ourselves such a disservice by not saying, well, but have we tested that? Do we know that that's true? And that's, we never want that to actually always be true, because we always want to be evolving and growing. I worked with an organization where I was managing 2 engineering teams, and we had our users literally in the building next door, in the parking, like across the parking lot, and they had never sat with them. They had never had a conversation with them. Everything was done through a product owner. And I said, well, what if we go over as an experiment? So not pitching it as this thing that we do forever and ever, amen. It's, we do it if it's valuable. And if it's not, then we refine or we pivot. But what if you actually sat with users to discover what they were doing? Because they were so deadline driven. All they knew is that we have to get X, Y, and Z done. And I said, those deadlines, we can have conversations about them, and we need to make sure we're moving in the right direction. So for about 2 months, we had our engineers going across the street, which I thought was like the cutest thing. I would like watch them walk over, like leave the confines of their little cubes and go across the street. And they'd come back and say like, oh my gosh, I learned so much about what we're doing right and also what we're doing wrong. And we went through some best practices in terms of user research, like not guiding people watching them experience it how they experience it, not how they should, but how they actually do. And we were actually able to pivot a few of the things that we were doing because we were absolutely moving in the wrong direction. And it's usually not this gap that's ginormous. It's usually these small shifts, but they can add up to be a lot of value.
Absolutely. And to the point of small shifts, I think sometimes a sentiment that I've seen people express is a fear of discovery, because it feels like this big process. Like, we need 3 months, we need 6 months, we got to talk to this many users, we have to write reports, we have to get all these people on it. And it feels like it's an overwhelming, just cumbersome task that you have to take on. And like, I think that's what kind of leads people to just initially be like, we don't have time for that, right? Like, we don't have a 6 months to figure this out. We don't have 20 people to put on this. I don't want to read through 20 reports. Like, but to your point, there are small things that you can do, right? Small steps you can take, like you said, just sending them across the street, right? And then that gives you enough insight to decide, is there something here that we want to delve deeper into, or are we not seeing anything that makes any sense? And being able to make a decision of whether you not want to double down on that decision to pursue discovery and discover a little bit more, or if you want to take a step back and maybe decide, I don't think this is the right direction for right now. I think explaining to people, or maybe making people more clear about the fact that they do have options and what discovery looks like and how long it takes and the kind of information they want to pull from it, is a warming idea. And I think it makes people a little bit more comfortable with exploring discovery as a viable option to get to delivery, not necessarily a hindrance in getting to delivery.
Right. No, I totally agree. I'm wondering if you have any stories that you can share around when discovery has kind of gone off the rails, because I've certainly seen that happen too, where it's been, we're going to do some research on some stuff and it's done in a siloed way as opposed to iteratively together with delivery. I'm wondering if you've experienced any of that with teams and kind of what that looked like.
Absolutely. So I worked with a team once who it was their responsibility to essentially sell the product, right? And so in order to sell the product, they could do customizations. And so they were going on meeting with all of these special interest groups who are going to be end users of the product to get their buy-in. And they just asked questions and made these long lists of things that they wanted to deliver to the customer based on what they'd heard, right? And they didn't really ask any questions, just a long, like a dumpster list of things. Wasn't necessarily working with the team that was building it, right?
Yep.
And so again, built out this long list of needs, this long list of features, and it was just like, and they took it back to the delivery team. The delivery team was like, well, why do they want this? And they're like, well, they didn't ask for it specifically, but because this is what they do, and this is what we think would be helpful to them, we want to be able to pitch this to them essentially, we want to build all these features to get their buy-in versus figure out what it is that they actually need and then try to build features that actually support that. And so a lot of that was conversations in literally just me kind of going with the teams as they were meeting with these special interest groups and being like, hey, let's ask more questions about like, well, what are the things that are faced? What are the problems that are facing your organization? What are the hindrances right now? What do you have the capacity to do? I know in particular, there was one organization that was, they served people who were experiencing homelessness, right? And so they wanted people who needed potential somewhere to stay or immediate housing to be able to reach out to them. And they're like, oh, well, we'll just build a feature where the shelters you work with can list their beds and people can just go onto the device and find the beds. And they were like, this is great. And I was like, wait, can the shelter support that technology, right? And after asking a few more questions, they realized, well, that's a great idea. The shelters as they existed didn't have access to the hardware or software to be able to utilize that type of system, right? So what is another way that we can help people gain awareness about what resources they have available to them that is feasible for the service providers? It was really interesting. And eventually they came up with a really nice solution. But, and I think that story was that experience was important for me because a lot of times, sometimes we think that people aren't asking users because they think that they know best. And sometimes people aren't asking users because they're actually just really excited about solving a problem and kind of just like jumping over, confirming whether or not the things that they want to produce are feasible for the people they're producing them for.
Oh, so much. There's like a million different directions I could go on that, but it reminds me so much of our so some of our product content, product training content, including our boot camps, like there's this slide that I always think of that's you are not your user. And I think that we in tech get really excited about being able to create amazing things for people. However, that doesn't always mean that it's the right thing, right?
Yeah.
So we might get excited and say, oh, we could do this, we could do that. But then it's the question of, well, but should you? Like, do they actually have the capabilities? To your point, we actually have a local app around here that is exactly what you're describing. It's, if you need to get a spot at a shelter, like, how do you identify if there's a bed available? And then how do you maintain that software? And what's the conversation like with those nonprofits who you're working with, right? Exactly. I feel like I've seen folks get carried away because it's easy to take your eyes off the prize, and it then becomes kind of like a blank canvas, which is awesome, but it's a business. We're not going to be able to have all the bells and whistles and have like the gold-plated car in 3 months time. That's not going to be something that we're going to be able to do. I had a similar experience, slightly adjacent, but I worked with a team that I was managing who had the ability to work on a brand new project, which rarely happens, like totally greenfield. They weren't having to, retire anything or sunset any products. They weren't having to integrate anything. It was literally going to be brand new, and it got to be their ideas. And so they were really excited. We had a brainstorming session around, what's our product strategy? What do we want to do? And it ended up expanding from 1 day to 2 days to a week. And I was trying not to be the helicopter manager. And I was saying, you do you, what's your goal for the day? Where do you want to be? And then I would come back and they'd say, we have all these amazing ideas. And I would say, that's great. Does it align with the vision of the product and what we've said we're going to deliver in 3 months? Some of that absolutely did, but then there was all this extra stuff. And that doesn't mean that stuff's never going to be valuable, but we haven't validated that it's going to be. So we know the thing that we've already tested is going to be valuable. Well, what are ways that we can kind of get a little bit more granular with that and actually interact with some users to ensure, again, that we're on the right path? And if we have a deadline that we're working against, I think a lot of times there's a misconception. It's like these anti-patterns that happen with anything around agility, where it's you don't have requirements, you don't have deadlines. That's just not the reality of the world that we live in. It's right. People need things delivered. If we're not to a point where we can continuously deliver something and we're starting small, then what does that look like? So I think doing that in smaller slices and trying not to kill the groove of people being excited to build something, like that's great. And let's make sure it aligns to what we're doing. Does that make sense? Yeah,
absolutely. And I think even in the title of the live today, deadlines, discovery, and delivery, I like the fact that delivery and deadlines are there two distinct words because they are very different things. I think a lot of times people conflate the two, right? Like the deadline is like you can't have a delivery without a deadline, and you can't have deadlines without delivery. And that's not true, right? To your point, you can deliver. There need to be deadlines. There need to be a level of expectation, just because even if your team is working in the most perfectly agile way, there are teams that you're probably working with or that you're supporting or that you're working adjacent to that do have very real timelines, right? If there's a marketing campaign centered around the product that you're releasing, they can't put no date into the release, right? Of a marketing. You got to put it launches on the 15th. And can that be changed? Yes. But realistically, like other teams need to know what you're doing and what to expect from you so that they can build their own plans. But to your point, what do you deliver by that deadline? And the fact that just because the deadline has come and passed doesn't mean that you don't continue to deliver on the same thing and maybe build on it, make it a little bit more robust as time goes on. And those can be hard conversations to have, especially if people aren't used to working in that way. However, what I found is that if people are open to the process or open to exploring different ways of working and there's compromise, right? To your point, like everyone's not going to be an agile warrior and everyone's not going to work in a completely Kanban state. However, people are usually open to making small changes that show benefits. And so I think open-mindedness and compromising on both sides is really key to having a successful launch or delivery of any product or service.
Yeah, I so agree. And I think those can be really tough conversations, especially with, I see it less with folks who are, I mean, this makes sense, but less with folks who are newer to the industry, or I've, taught training classes for folks who have only been in tech like a couple years, and there's a little bit more flexibility, but we get so ingrained in our habits, but also in our fears and the pressure. I always call it the pressure cooker syndrome, where you're a leader and you're expected to have your teams deliver something. So you have internal pressure that's coming from your leader, that's coming from their leader. And then it just keeps going down, 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 and then starts like blowing out the sides, right? And now all of a sudden you're willing to cut corners in ways where sometimes it's justified and makes sense, but other times you're just being reactive and in a fear-based state. And, like we talk about in our psych safety class around like amygdala hijack, if you are in that reactive mode and you're not able to think logically and clearly, you're just completely afraid and running a million miles an hour and saying, we just have to get this done. I remember receiving a phone call at about 11:30 at night from my boss's boss the day before the end of a quarter saying, hey, I thought this stuff was going to be done. I went and looked at the Azure boards. It looks like they're not going to have it complete. And I said, correct. We had this conversation many times that they are not going to be completely done with it. And that's going to have to be okay. And it got to the point where he was actually asking me to fudge some numbers to say like, well, let's just make it look like we've done it. And I think that's fine. And it's not fine. Like then not only are we afraid, but we're doing things that are going to destroy any trust that exists between this senior leader and other leadership people and the team. It's basically like erupting this thing. And I kind of said, hang on, like, what's the cost of being honest about not hitting a deadline? So often deadlines aren't hit. So why is this? It all comes down to things like ego and being afraid to speak up. And to be fair, it's also not completely this leader's fault, because this was embedded and baked into the organization that you have to hit these deadlines. It has to be like 80% likelihood that you're going to hit it. And if you don't, ... Well, the team is doing the best that they can. We've been as honest as we can. And now it's really up to that leader to say, what am I going to do? And that's kind of what I offered up to him. I said, hey, because, we were friends. And I said, I get that you're scared. I also need you to understand that this is not the way. So let's have a conversation about how we can be honest about what we've needed to deliver. And it wasn't because we had done too much discovery work. It wasn't because things weren't getting done. It's simply because we had overpromised and underdelivered, which happens all the time because it was too big, right? These are all opportunities for us to learn the next time around. It's not, if you don't do this, like you're off to the chopping block. It's okay, well, how do we actually reflect on what we've done and what we've promised, and how was it too much, and where, and what did we do?
Absolutely. And if you're watching and you have any stories, comments, questions about experiences you've had with balancing deadlines, discovery, and delivery, please feel free to leave them in the chat so Tara and I can chime in on those as well. I think that aspect of fear that comes around not being able to hit a target that was set, it's so real. And to me, it speaks very deeply to the can we have it all aspect. I know, industrial logic, when pitching or when proposing assessments to organizations, sometimes organizations are like, well, I don't, why is it worth it to pay that much money just to know what we're bad at? I know that we're bad at it. Let's just jump right in. Right. But I think part of that knowing, having a clear picture of where am I really and what am I struggle with is really important in the can we have it all, because to me, that speaks a lot to what does balance look like for your organization. I think sometimes people look at it as, in order for it to be balanced, we have to be hitting at 100 on all three of these things. And the reality is that sometimes you're going to hit really well on two and not as good on the third one. And that's okay, as long as you understand what the trade-offs are for being in that state, right? But it also gives you a really good place. It also really gives you a really good marker and idea of, hey, where are we starting from, and where are the places that we can start to improve on? Because whether or not you're clear or not on it it doesn't change the fact that that's really where you are. And that's really how a lot of people in your organization or in your teams are framing their work and how they're operating from. So really being clear on, okay, maybe we're really bad at deadlines, right? We set all these deadlines for these products. We set all these deadlines for these releases and we continually miss them. Well, why do we miss them? Well, if you know that you're missing them and you understand why you're missing them, then you can start to work towards a place where we're setting realistic goals for delivery that are meeting those numbers, right? But to your point, if in the situation you're in, if we're constantly fudging numbers and we're kind of, playing smoke and mirrors and we're not really acknowledging when we're not hitting these deadlines, we can't be honest about how we fix that, right? And how we get to a place where we are hitting our numbers, right? And maybe if you hit your numbers consistently all the time, maybe that means you're not pushing your teams hard enough, or maybe you're not pushing your team, not hard enough, like working harder, but hard enough as far as setting goals that are just out of reach, pushing their limits as far as like their talent and their creativity, not manual labor.
No, I know what you mean. I mean, I think that makes a ton of sense. And I know we have just 5 minutes left, but this gets us to kind of the peak of this title is like, can you have it all? The answer is yes. And you're not going to be perfect every single time that you do it. But I know, again, that you and I have talked about this plenty offline, Jay, but, oftentimes when we come into a new gig or we're teaching a new class and we ask people like kind of what are the struggles or challenges that they see, it's everything. It's all of it all at once. It's like, well, I don't think we communicate well enough. Also, we keep missing deadlines. Also, we never have time to do discovery work. Also, we end up having to do rework. It's all the things. So then the question is, that's okay, so where do you want to start? Where do we want to start when it comes to why all of these things are happening at once? I think that at the root of that is why. We need to be asking ourselves why. If we continue to just trudge forward, like you mentioned in the example that I gave, you're afraid, so you lie about some dates. What good does that do you? That's kind of like a phew moment, like, ooh, I dodged a bullet. You're going to be right back there 3 months later or a month later or whatever it is.
Probably in a worse position because now you have to make up for this deadline that you missed and also still try to accomplish a goal that's probably set a little bit off anyway because you're using your previous process for deciding that.
Right. And so I think where I've seen a lot of success in organizations being able to work like this and ones that I've coached are when they get a really sweet cadence down, when it's let's talk about what our strategy is. We're all clear on it. Cool. I'm a big fan of the like play it back for each other. We all get it. Then the next step is, doing a bit of discovery work and experimenting with it. So it's delivering smaller slices of things. And then you're learning as you're going, making sure, I don't care if, some people are like, well, we don't like to do retrospectives because retrospectives aren't valuable. Well, why aren't they valuable to you? It's all about, I think, getting to that why and then iterating in smaller slices so that a few months down the road, I recently was working with a team who was really struggling with kind of a little bit of everything. But once we were doing a faster turnaround time of experiment, either refine or pivot, and then deliver it and then get feedback and then keep going. They're like, whoa, we're actually getting stuff done. I'm like, right. Because we're not waiting and we're not investing in some of that time up front. We just don't need to invest in as much of it. I think when people hear the word research or discovery, they get freaked out and it's like, oh, we're going to take 6 months to do a thing. No. Like maybe even just a day, maybe a couple hours.
Yeah. We have a little over a minute left. Are there any kind of closing thoughts, remarks that you wanted to make for everyone? Anything upcoming with IEL that we should probably let people know about?
So I guess I'd love to share that we do this, Jay and I do this kind of work all the time, working with product teams, helping you find ways to get into a good groove with, being able to pay attention to what you need to deliver, being aware of deadlines and having conversations about them, and being able to do some discovery work. So if you are interested, please feel free to reach out to either one of us. You can reach us on LinkedIn. We are there in the links, and I will share in the comments some of the product stuff that you can check out with us. If you're interested in digging more into product work and you have a team who's really struggling, let's get together and have a conversation. If it's product strategy, if it's UX, whatever it is, if it's a kind of a meshing of those things, we are here and happy to help. Anything that you wanted to share, Jay?
No, I think that covered it. Thanks everyone for joining us today. And Tara, thanks for chatting. I know I enjoy speaking to you all the time.
Thanks, Jay. I know I haven't seen you in a minute. This was super fun. And thank you everyone for coming and joining us today. Jay, thank you for coming and chatting with me. And yeah, reach out to us. Let's have a conversation. And I hope you have a fabulous rest of your day.
Thanks.
Thank you.